I am super excited about this next series that we're starting today. It's called Sunday School. Sunday School at Faith Chapel, right? Here's the deal. This is what we're doing. For the rest of the summer, every Sunday morning, every child in our kids ministry will be learning the same Bible story that we're going to be doing in here. Okay, so we're going to be doing the same thing. So what that means is they'll be studying it at their level and we'll be studying it at our level. But if you have kids, the goal is that you would leave knowing exactly what they studied, right? And so it's not just about knowing a little bit more about the Bible. It's knowing that this afternoon at lunchtime, or maybe around the dinner table, or maybe on the drive home, while you're tucking your kids into bed tonight, you can ask them, hey, what'd you learn about God today? What'd you learn at church today? And then, guess what? They can ask you the same question. And then your answers should be similar, at least. One of the 1 hour in kids ministry, like here at Faith Chapel, we believe it's a wonderful thing. Like kids love the kids ministry. Our volunteers they're wonderful. If you'd like to volunteer in kids ministry, we'd love to have you there. It's great, but 1 hour is just not enough. And so we believe that as parents, you need to be involved in the spiritual formation of your children. And so this is an opportunity for you to do that and to know exactly what they talked about. And now your kids will actually know what we talked about in here. And so it gives us the opportunity for conversations. And so today, our kids are going to be learning about one of the most unlikely heroes in the Bible. It's a woman named Rahab. And if you've been in church for a while, you might know a thing or two about Rahab. First, right, we know that she hid some spies, but second, we also know that she was a prostitute. You may know her as Rahab the harlot. Here's the deal. I promise you in kids ministry, we're not using those words, okay? My wife, Becky, who's serving back there today, she's not going to talk about Rahab's sex life, I promise you. Like, it's going to be okay. She's just a woman in kids ministry. But yeah, you probably know her as Rahab the harlot. And if we're honest, right, that's probably not a way that you would choose to be introduced. Imagine if every time someone introduced you, they always led with the worst thing that you've ever done, right? Imagine that, right? Like, whatever the worst thing you've ever done is, when I introduce you to someone, I'm like, oh, this is so-and-so, the worst thing they've ever done. Right? That's not really what we like. But unfortunately, we sometimes do that, right? We do that to other people. Maybe not out loud so much, but we tend to define people by their failures or by their addictions, by their mistakes. And this is what I think is so beautiful about the gospel. While the Bible doesn't hide who Rahab was, it doesn't hide her past, it also doesn't let her past have the final word. And so because this story, when God tells her story, the story is a story of redemption. And that's really what today is about. That's what the whole Bible's about. So this isn't just a woman. It's not just about two spies. It's a story about the kind of people that God loves and the kind of people that God chooses to rescue. So we're going to begin reading together. We'll be in Joshua chapter 2 if you have your Bible. Should be on the screens as well. But before we do, I want you to remember where this story kind of lands in history. We're in the Old Testament. That's where Joshua is. Moses, you might remember Moses. Remember, he leads the Israelites out of Egypt. If you were here for our last series in Joseph, you actually know how they got to Egypt because Joseph saved these people. And now it's time for them to move out of Egypt. They've had 40 years in the wilderness. Moses has died by this point. Joshua is the new leader. And so God tells the nation of Israel, hey, it's time. It's time to stop wandering. It's time to trust. It's time to enter into the promised land. And here's the problem, though. Standing directly in front of them is one of the largest, strongest cities in all of Canaan. It's a city called Jericho. And the people in Jericho are huge, right? These are big people, strong people. And so Joshua, what he's going to do is he's going to send 2 spies into the city to see what's going on there. So let's go ahead and read Joshua chapter 2, verse 1. Then Joshua, the son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. All right, we'll stop there. We'll get to the next part in just a bit. But I kind of like this. You might remember Moses, when Moses was leading them, he did the same thing when he was in charge. He sent some spies into the land. He actually sends 12 spies into the land. 10 of them come back and they are terrified. They're like, these guys are too big, they're too large. I don't want to deal with this. There's giants in the land. And only Joshua, same Joshua, right, much younger, Joshua and his buddy Caleb, they come in and they believe God. They're like, hey, we got to go take that land because God said he would give us the land. It doesn't matter how big they are. In fact, God said that fighting wouldn't even be necessary. The whole plan, when they were supposed to take this land, is there would be no fighting, there would be no bloodshed. God was going to handle this. And so as you continue through the Old Testament, now you start seeing fighting and bloodshed and all that kind of stuff. That's because everyone is operating outside of God's plan. But here we are, what the original plan was is that God was going to give them the land, and he was going to give them the land a little bit by little bit until they had the whole thing. God was going to drive them out by locusts, drive the people out by locusts. He's going to drive them out by other things and other things. And so everyone was going to be safe. The people who left were going to go move into another land, and this land would be given to God's chosen people who he had promised it to. But here's what I kind of like about what Joshua does. Instead of sending 12 people, he's like, hey, I'm just going to send 2. Right? I think he kind of learns from the mistakes of the past. And we read something here that catches us off guard. The spies, right, they enter into Jericho, and they're going to stay at Rahab's house. Okay? He sends 2 people that he can trust, that love God, that understand what God's will is for the situation, and he sends them in. And at the end of verse 1, we see this. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. Now, before you let your imagination kind of run wild, I want you to understand what's happening here for a bit. And I'll start with this. The Bible is wild. Okay, the Bible can be absolutely wild. But as it turns out, this is probably a little less wild than it sounds. And yes, I know what it sounds like. They went to a prostitute's place and they stayed there and they stayed overnight there. But the text doesn't seem to indicate anything really actually happened in that nature. And so we're going to kind of leave it at that. But I do want to answer, and we got to kind of ask this question, like, why? Of all the places they could have gone, of all the places they could have stayed, why? Why do they go to the house of a harlot? Well, more than likely, this would have been a brothel of sorts. It would have been probably ran and managed by Rahab. And you might be thinking, okay, well, Justin, you're not making this sound any better. But you have to realize that this is probably the safest place in all of Jericho for a couple of spies. Right? Rahab's not going to be quick to turn over a couple of potential clients, right? Also, it would stand to reason that a brothel would be the kind of haven for unofficial news, right, where all the gossip happened and all the inside stuff kind of happened. The kind of news that spies would be looking for. It's very similar. If you watched a Western, any fans of Westerns? A couple, all right. Or maybe Star Wars, right? It's a space Western. Remember when Obi-Wan and Luke, right? They go into Tatooine, and they go to Mos Eisley spaceport. You might remember this line. It says, "You'll never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy." And what they do is they find their pilot, and they go to find a pilot, and they go, where do they go to find a pilot? They go to the cantina, right, where the unofficial information kind of circulates. It's very brothel-esque as you kind of watch Star Wars in that scene. And so I think that's kind of the scene if we want to look at it in that kind of way. But here's what I don't want us to miss. The real reason, right? This is the real reason God would choose a harlot. Because the story isn't primarily about the spies. The story isn't even primarily about Jericho. The story is about what God is doing in one woman's heart. Because before God conquers a city, he's going to rescue a sinner. And I love this, right? Because that's exactly how God works in us. That's how he still works today. God is always more interested in rescuing people than he is in simply winning battles. So we're going to skip down to verse 8. I want you to read that with me. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up to the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. Listen closely, listen carefully to what she says here. I know the Lord has given you this land. Right, those first two words, I know, right? They're incredible. I know. It's not like, hey, I kind of think that you might be the ones that God wants. I've heard rumors. No, it's like, I know. And the question we have to ask then is how does she know? How could she know? She wasn't there when God parted the Red Sea. She wasn't there when Pharaoh's army drowned. She simply had heard about what God had done. In fact, here's what she says if you read verses 11 and 12. Well, we'll start in 10. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water in the Red Sea when you came out of Egypt. And when you died, and what you did in Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, who were completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven, above and on the earth below. Here's what blows my mind. Everyone in Jericho had heard the same stories. Everyone. They knew something. The king had heard. The soldiers had heard. The merchants had heard. The families had heard. The whole city knew Israel is coming. So the difference in Rahab and the rest of these people wasn't information. The difference was faith. Everybody had the facts. Only Rahab trusted God who is behind the facts. Church, that's still the difference today. There are people who know an awful lot about Jesus. You know the Christmas story, you know the Easter story, you know the Ten Commandments, you might know a few Bible verses, but knowing about Jesus is not the same as trusting Jesus. Biblical faith is more than believing that God is real. So later, we're going to see that the walls of this city are destroyed. But Rahab believes even before the walls fall down. She believes before she has proof, before anything changes around her. She trusts God while she's still living inside enemy territory. And that's exactly what faith does. Faith doesn't wait until everything makes sense. We want it all to make sense and before we can jump on the Jesus train, but faith comes before it makes sense. Faith says, I've seen God's character, I've seen enough of God, I've seen enough of who he is in order to trust him with what I can't see yet. So just want y'all to look at me real quick. Especially if you're struggling with faith in Jesus. Because some of you are waiting until every question is answered before you'll surrender. That's not faith. If you could explain everything, you wouldn't need faith. Faith says, I don't know everything, but I know enough. I know enough about Jesus. This is Rahab's story. She heard and she believed. And that belief would then change everything for her. And what's amazing is that before Joshua ever reaches Rahab, God is already reaching her. Before Joshua gets there, God's already working with her. Before the spies ever knock on the door, God had already been preparing her heart. Never underestimate what God is doing in someone's heart before you ever have a conversation with them. Because you might think that you're the first person talking to your coworker or your friend or your neighbor about Jesus, but you're probably not, because God's already been working. You might think that you're the first person to pray for your son or your daughter, but God's already working. God is always working before we ever see him working. And Rahab is going to be living proof of this. Now, get ready, because here's something that I think makes Rahab's faith so remarkable. It doesn't just stay in her head. It moves to her hands. Look what happens next. It says the king of Jericho, right? The king of Jericho, he hears about the Israelites. He hears about these spies in the city. And so he sends messengers to Rahab's house and he says, hey, you bring these guys out to me. And just stop and think for a second, because Rahab now has a decision to make. She can side with the king, the one she's always known, or she can side with God, the one she's just begun to believe in. That's a big decision. Because just to understand, like Rahab she's not simply risking embarrassment. She's risking her life. If she's caught hiding enemy spies, she's dead. She's gone. She's putting everything on the line. And here's what I love about this, because the Bible, it never celebrates Rahab because she was just so clever. Oh, look how clever she was, that she was able to hide these spies and she was able to help them escape. It celebrates her because she had faith. In fact, in Hebrews 11, it's New Testament, it says, by faith, Rahab, the prostitute, welcomed the spies in peace. James chapter 2, New Testament again, they're talking about Rahab. Wasn't Rahab also justified in receiving the messengers and sending them out by a different route? And here's what we need to see about our faith. Faith acts. Faith obeys. There should be action to our faith. And so, church, there's a huge difference between believing that something is true and trusting it enough to stake your life on it. And that's what Rahab does. She isn't simply agreeing that Israel's God is powerful. She's entrusting her future to him. She's saying, like, if I'm going to survive, it's because I'm going to trust the Lord. Let me ask you what are you trusting in today? Because we all trust in something. And some people, we trust in our bank accounts or our retirement or our politics or our education, or it's simply like, I'm not going to trust anybody but myself. But Rahab teaches us something beautiful. She says, the safest place in Jericho isn't behind its massive walls. The safest place is where God was. And it's still true today. Your security, it isn't found in how much money you have, or the job you have, or your health, or your reputation. Your security, it's found in Jesus. Everything else, right, it's going to fade away. It's going to fail. It's going to fall. But Jesus never does. So one of the saddest realities I think in the American church is that we've become really good at admiring faith without actually exercising faith, right? Well, we'll admire missionaries, but we're afraid to share the gospel with our neighbor. Or we'll admire generosity, but we're afraid to trust God with our own personal finances. We admire prayer, but we actually slow down enough to pray. Or we admire obedience as long as it doesn't cost me anything. So Rahab's faith, right, it costs her. And real faith always does. So here's what Jesus said. Jesus says, if anyone wants to follow me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Following Jesus has never been about comfort. But it's always been about trust. This is the most beautiful part. Every step that Rahab takes towards God, God is already taking towards Rahab. She hides the spies. And then the spies make her a promise. Look at verses 17 and 18. Now the men said to her, this oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless, when we enter the land, you have tied this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and your mother and your brothers and all your family into your house. So here's the deal. When Israel returns, when they come for the battle of Jericho, these two spies, what they say is, hey, as long as you'll tie this scarlet cord in your window, you and everyone inside your house will be spared. Now, church, does that remind you of anything? It's because many, 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 many years earlier in Egypt, 40 plus years earlier, God had told his people to place the blood of a lamb on the doorposts of their homes. And when judgment came, everyone under the blood would be spared. And then now in the book of Joshua, everyone under the scarlet cord, the red rope, will be spared. Right, the cord itself, right, has no magical powers. It's not lucky. It's not superstition. It's simply identified the people who God had trusted, the people who had trusted God's promise, right, just like Exodus. And that's exactly what salvation looks like today. Right? We're not saved because a cross might hang on our wall. We're not saved because we own a Bible. We're not saved even because we attend church. We're saved because we've trusted the one whose blood was shed for us. The scarlet cord points us forward even to a greater rescue. It points us to Jesus, whose blood would save all who believe. Let's finish our Sunday school story here. The spies leave. They get to escape. Joshua eventually leads Israel across the Jordan River. There's even a fun miracle there. And then they get to Jericho. And as God said, he said he would go before them. He said he would take care of them. There's not even a battle. It's so funny, we call it the Battle of Jericho. We grew up singing a song, if you grew up in church like me, that Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. But Joshua didn't fight any battle here. Here, what they do is they walk around, remember, they walk around the city for 7 days, and then on that last day, they sound trumpets and have a large shout, and they praise God, and the walls just come down because God takes care of it. And can you imagine what a day that would have been? Like the strongest city in all of the land, the only, the city that everyone thought was untouchable, the walls that everybody trusted, gone. Everybody moves into confusion, and right in the middle of all of this destruction, one house still stands. One family is safe. One scarlet cord hanging from a window. And Joshua 6:25 says, Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. Don't miss the irony here. The safest place in Jericho was not behind 40-foot walls. The safest place in Jericho was under God's promise. Everyone else trusted the walls, but Rahab trusted the Lord. Everyone else believed their city could save them, but Rahab believed only God could save her. And so, church, people are still trusting walls today. People are still trusting things that can't save them. They're still trusting their success and their politics and their own morality, but it can't save you. And we like to think that because they're good people, everything's going to work out. But every wall we build eventually comes down. If your hope is built on anything temporary, your hope will collapse. Jesus told a story about two men building a house. Remember, one built it on sand and one built it on the rock, and the storms come to both. And the difference wasn't the storm. The difference was the foundation. Rahab teaches us the exact same lesson. Don't trust the walls. Trust the God who stands even when the walls fall. That's where the real security is found. I was listening to a podcast this week. They were talking about a man, he's long past now, named Dallas Willard. And somebody asked Dallas if you could think of one word that describes God. It's a hard one, right? There's a lot of good words that describe God. If you could think of one word that describes God, what would it be? And Dallas, his answer was relaxed. Relaxed. He's not up there worrying about anything. Jesus comes down, God in the flesh, and experiences all the pain that we experience, and he cries, and he weeps, and he experiences temptation, but he's relaxed. He's not worried. He's with the one who's in charge. And that's what I see here in Rahab's story. I kind of see this woman who seems a little relaxed in her faith, in a good way, right? Relaxed. Because she's taken care of. You build your house on the rock, you can relax. Don't trust the walls. Trust the God who stands when the walls fall. And you can be relaxed. That's where real security is found. Here's my favorite part, though, of Rahab's story. The scarlet cord was really cool, and how it goes back to the blood on the doorpost, and how it goes forward to the death of Jesus and this blood that takes care of us. Those are really cool things for us to notice there. But I don't think that was the greatest miracle. I think what happens next is, it says Rahab leaves Jericho, and she becomes part of God's people. That last part of verse 25, we kind of rolled over it, I think, but I think it's so good. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. Now, obviously not to this day, she's dead and gone, but when the writer wrote it. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. How can she live amongst the Israelites to this day? Because she begins to worship the God of Israel. Because her identity changes, because her future changes, and her family changes. And then so years later, here's what she does. She actually marries a man named Solomon. They have a son named Boaz. You might recognize that name. Who marries Ruth. They have Obed. Obed has Jesse. Jesse has David, King David. Eventually, out of the line of King David, Jesus Christ is born. Just think about that for a little bit. When Matthew begins the New Testament by giving us a genealogy of Jesus that most of us don't read, you know who's on that list? Rahab, a Gentile, prostitute, outsider. A woman no one would have ever expected. And God says, she's part of my story. Right? That's how the gospel works. Jesus doesn't come for people who have perfect pasts. He comes for people who need redemption. Jesus doesn't come for people just who look like they have it all together. He comes for sinners. He comes for regular people. People like Rahab, people like Peter, people like Paul, people like me, people like you. And the gospel doesn't ignore your past. It redeems it. The enemy wants to tell you, you'll always be what you've been. But Jesus says, if anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. The enemy says, you'll never change. But Jesus says, I make all things new. The enemy reminds you of your failures, and Jesus reminds you of his grace. Rahab wasn't saved because she was good. She was saved because she believed. And that's the same invitation, right? That same invitation is being extended to every one of us today. Okay. I want to bring us back to our kids for a second. So if you have kids in children's ministry, this will help you out a little bit. This afternoon, one of your kids, they might ask you, right? Mom, Dad, hey, why did Rahab hang a red rope on the window? Don't tell them because the spies told her to. Wrong answer. They did tell him that, but wrong answer. Tell them this instead. Because Rahab believed God would keep his promise. And then tell them something better. That red rope reminds us that one day Jesus would shed his blood for everyone who trusts him. And you can be rescued.